So Tracy, you have this background where you have a PhD in epidemiology. You are a doctor. You have seen what's going on in Denmark. In 2020, Denmark turned out to be quite an interesting place, especially as time went on. A huge contrast with how the United States handled the pandemic. At the same time, you're living in California in the center of COVID craziness. Probably the center is where I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so you're seeing it firsthand, a very different policy. And of course, you have this background as an epidemiologist and as a doctor. So let's take yourself back to the early days of the pandemic. How are you seeing things in 2020?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you said something key there, which was as time went on, like the policies differed very quickly. Because in the beginning, I feel like the whole world was really, afraid and uncertain what was going on, like how serious was this virus, what were the risks that were being posed to, like, say, middle-aged people, older people. Like, we were all trying to get a sense of, how people were going to be affected and the likelihood of dying if we ourselves got it, or our parents or our children. And I do feel like one thing that we knew very early on was that children seemed to be very mildly affected by it. And so I read the Danish newspapers, watch the Danish news. That's what we do with our kids. We actually still speak Danish in our house. And on April 18th, we watched the Danish news as they very excitedly reopened the schools. And it was this beautiful thing where they opened up Tivoli Gardens and they opened up like Cub Scout houses and all these outdoor places. And they said, we have to get the children back in school because parents can't start working again unless their kids are in school. So people listening to this should understand that over 90% of Danish mothers work full time. So it's very different, obviously, than in the United States. And but in their society, the well-being of the children really always comes first. And so they knew that the children needed a place to be during the day before the parents could go back to work. And so they opened their schools. Now, Sweden, of course, never closed the primary schools. And Norway, a week after Denmark, opened their schools as well. And it went really well. So they started out, kind of a hybrid outdoors and indoors. And then they kind of started moving things more back indoors. And by June, we had data from comparing Sweden versus Finland. And there didn't seem to be any worse outcomes among the children or the teachers in Sweden that had kept the schools open, and Finland that had closed the schools. We had data from across Europe that came out June 10th that basically was like a regression discontinuity analysis for the statistical nerds out there that didn't show that there was an impact of reopening schools on community transmission. And Holland,
So by summer of 2020, we had real empirical data that closing schools was not necessary to protect older people, that the children were not particularly harmed from going to school in terms of the COVID risk. And of course, we knew from before the pandemic how vital it is and how important it is for children to be attending school in person.
Right. And if you think about it, this really makes sense that children, they're always going to be somewhere. And so children, if they're not in school, they're going to be, with their grandparents, they're going to be out in the community, they're going to be with their friends. It was never a solution for them to be like at home in their basement, every day, like alone. I mean, it scares me to think that might have happened. But
Tracy, you're sitting in the United States. You're looking at the data that's coming out of Scandinavia, and it's crystal clear. I also don't speak Swedish or Danish or anything, but I can read epidemiological tables. I also was looking at these data, and it was so clear. And yet, American health policy people, American public health people, in summer of 2020, they waffle back and forth. At one point, some of them are saying yes, open schools, but then sometime in the middle of the summer, it looked like American public health closed its mind to the possibility and fully got on board.
Absolutely. That was my impression as well, because I was posting on Facebook from June data coming out of Europe, and I was going to mention Holland as well, because they were saying, gosh, this is very interesting. We're seeing very little transmission from children, and they had the same positive experience that Scandinavia had with opening their schools, and they saw very little transmission. Of course, I should mention these were all unmasked children, and sometime in the middle of the summer, the reactions to what I was writing really changed. Like before, I would say the first week of July, there was so much positive energy and support for the idea of reopening schools in the United States. And after, it must have been around the time Trump said, open the schools, it was very strange how people who knew me from my childhood and people who had been following me for a long time, like, started writing to me, asking me if I was like a right-wing Trump supporter. Like, even though I couldn't really figure out what was going on. I have to admit, I wasn't on Twitter at that point, and so I know I was missing a lot of the political background for what was happening. But I did realize that Trump said open the schools, and so I just didn't understand, and I was really sad that suddenly it became a political question and not a question of what was best for children and what was best for society. And I didn't really change my message.
I mean, I spent a bunch of that fall as an expert witness for Florida in this school reopening case there. The governor there, Governor DeSantis, ordered that every school district in Florida have an in-person option for the children. And a bunch of the school districts, the teachers' unions got together and sued the state. And so I served as an expert witness. We eventually won. Actually, we lost in the trial court and eventually won in the appeals court. And every kid in Florida had to have access to a in-person option, or else the district would lose money. And they ended up having a much better experience than my kids in California. But you were doing very constructive things too at the time. I remember, I think the first time I learned about you, Tracy, was when I saw a study that you worked on in Wisconsin. On opening schools there. And I thought that was quite an important study. It was actually published by the CDC and the MMWR. So please tell us and the audience about that study and what you found.
Yeah, so that study, I should just back up 1 second and say as well that I was an advisor in California for our own diocese that had 13,000 children that we reopened in August of 2020 full time, and so I got introduced to physician Amy Falk, who is in Wisconsin, who was the first author of the Wood County, Wisconsin study, and knew that she was going to be studying transmission in schools. It was initially designed as a study where they were going to be giving masks to children, and they were going to see what the compliance was in terms of whether or not the kids would be able to wear the masks if they were given the masks. So that was kind of how the study was started. And this, we looked at over 5,000 students and staff in Wood County, Wisconsin, and it was public schools. It was a mixture of public and parochial schools. And over the fall semester of 2020, I suggested that we actually change the focus of the study to looking at how much transmission there was in the school versus came from outside of the school to in, and then compare like the rates that we were seeing in the school to the community. And so what we ended up finding was that over 95% of the cases that were identified in the school actually came into the schools from the community. And over that entire fall semester, when there were very high COVID case levels in the community, we only had 7 cases of transmission among those over 5,000 students and staff during that entire fall semester. And there were no cases of transmission that were verified or even suspected from the contact tracers. Now, they were independent of us to have gone from students to staff. And this was consistent with what we had been seeing in Europe because there were many European countries. I don't know if you remember at the time, Scotland and Holland, the Netherlands were saying, we find this very odd that the children seem to be transmitting so little to adults.
There was a study in Iceland, which I remember from March of 2020.
I remember you mentioning that on ZDog. That was the first time I ever heard you. And I was on my bike listening to it, and I stopped my bike and I thought, wait, and I looked because I was like, who is this person? This is a person that makes sense. And that was you, because Americans weren't citing the European data at the time. But I really appreciated the fact that you were paying attention to that.
We have to learn from other places, of course, and you've
absolutely. And then also North Carolina at almost the same time, they actually published a study in pediatrics. Danny Benjamin and Kenencia Zimmerman and their group at Duke published a study that
so now let's talk about that.
Similar results to ours. This wasn't the mask study. This was a study where they looked at transmission in the schools, and they found very similar results to our study.
Just talk about that for a second. So, because I thought those guys were really interesting. I thought you all were very interesting. I mean, the message to me was very clear that schools can open.
Yes.
And this is early 2021, right? Late 2020.
So the study came out in January of 2021, and even Tony Fauci himself said, wow, now we see that schools can and should open. He said that on the news, and I was elated. I was so excited until the CDC's new guidelines came out under the Biden administration, Rochelle Walensky, and they were stricter than they'd been before. They were based on community transmission levels and recommending 6 feet of distance, and it was all so insane to me. I didn't understand why.
And they called it data-driven reopening, but the data on which they premise the school openings, transmission rates in the area or whatever, had nothing to do with the studies that show that it was safe to reopen, even when the transmission levels are high.
And I was the senior author of the major study in their journal that published on school reopening, and they did not consult me. They did not consult any of my co-authors. They did not consult the Duke study authors. And we all thought, who are they consulting to get their guidelines? And of course, we later found out it was the teachers' unions was one, main actor in where they got their school reopening guidelines from. But Amy Falk and I we put out, and Monica Gandhi was a co-author on this as well. We put out another study outlining the fact that actually over 90% of the elementary students were not distanced 6 feet. They were less than 6 feet from each other. They weren't wearing masks at lunch indoors. They were indoors every day. They weren't wearing masks outdoors. They didn't install new ventilation systems. It was all the things that they were asking for that weren't things that we had done in our study. And then our study started being spun as a study that showed that masking children worked. Of course, our study wasn't a study of masks at all. Just because around 90% of them happened to wear it, for some portion of the day, not even, while they were sitting eating lunch together, somehow that was supposed to mean that masks were necessary. And when Norway had a study that was very similar to ours that came out almost at the same time, finding the same low rate of transmission in the schools, less than 5%. And in the study, they say masks are not recommended in the school environment in Norway. So they didn't mask, not even the teachers.
Let's explore this because it really is interesting, right? So the CDC, rather than looking at your study as good news, looking at the data from Europe and from North Carolina and elsewhere, saying, okay, we can reopen and just have kids have normal lives. They latched onto this as an opportunity to reinforce their recommendation about masking as a precondition. They latched onto it as a way to say, let's not reopen until transmission rates are low. Right? It seems like they were if you think of them as a scientific organization, they weren't reacting to scientific data in a way you'd expect. In fact, they were doing the opposite of what the scientific data were suggesting.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And it's actually a perfect segue to another study that I did related to the CDC and MMWR, which was on masks. Which
hold on, MMWR is Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. That's the CDC's in-house journal.
That's right.
In fact, once upon a time when I was young and foolish, I had like aspirations to publish in MMWR. That was a career aspiration of mine. And at this point, I don't think I ever want to see that journal again. But that's another thing.
Well, I don't know if you were young and foolish, because I have to say, when we had the results of the Wood County, Wisconsin study, I was the one who said, I think we should try to publish it in MMWR, because I knew that they had been the first journal that published about AIDS cases, and they, the rationale that I heard that they were the ones that published it was they were able to publish it so quickly because they don't have external peer review. So they were able to get sort of the scientific data just out to the public in a very rapid fashion. And I thought that's perfect for what we have here, because this is so important. We get kids back in school. And of course, I was naive to think not having the external peer review is a good thing. But
it turns out MMWR it's not actually a peer reviewed journal. It's what it is a in-house journal aimed at reinforcing the policy that the CDC has already adopted. In other words, it's a journal of where the science is. It's not that the science drives the policy. It's a situation where the CDC is publishing scientific results that are consistent with their policy, and not publishing scientific results that are inconsistent with their policy. It doesn't matter what the science actually says. What matters first and foremost is what their policy says.
Right. So I don't know if you remember that one of the 77 studies pertaining to masks that was published in MMWR from 2020 to 2023 was by a group that looked at a select number of counties in the United States that opened in 2021, and then looked at their case rates before opening school and then 2 weeks after opening school. And they found a barely significant p-value 0.049 relationship with the masks. So the counties where they had mask mandates in the schools, the pediatric case rates had dropped at a faster rate. Or I think it was they had risen at a slower rate. So anyway, they had fewer cases significantly. So I and a co-author from the University of Toronto, Ambarish Chandra, so we decided, let's expand that time period out, 9 weeks. We actually looked at multiple different weeks. We put it all in the supplement as sensitivity analysis, but we expanded it out 9 weeks, included all the available counties within the country. And we wanted to see if we would find, something similar, but we didn't. So we found no significant correlation between the mask mandates and the pediatric case rates. And so we sent that to MMWR because they had actually mentioned that this was like a preliminary study in that study. And we said, all right, well, now we've brought in all the counties and we expanded the data set, and they didn't accept it for publication. And the reason that they gave was, number one, they thought we needed more space than they would allow us to describe our methodology. And but we used the same methods as the other authors did, and that our findings were rife with polemics. And so, we ended up getting that published in the Journal of Infection, which has a very high impact factor. It's a really highly respected journal. And I ended up testifying about that in front of Congress because, MMWR, that's the CDC's journal, they're arbitrarily rejecting, studies that go against whatever their preconceived policy or whatever their preferred policy is.
I mean, they're doing science-based policy. They're doing policy-based science.
Yes.
It's a very, very different thing.
Yeah. And I think that they admit that. It's like, I don't know, it's antithetical to science, and yet they seem to admit that that's the case. And I had another publication with Vinay Prasad and Alison Haslam, where we looked at those 77 studies that were published, basically, that were about masks, and around 80% of them concluded that masks were effective, and over 3/4 of those used causal language like masks reduce cases, but only 35% of them even studied masks. And a large percentage of them weren't even significant. I just want to say they didn't have the methodology to say masks decrease cases.
Okay, can I ask about that? Because it seems to me that if you want to ask a question like that, especially one that's turns out to be so politically fraught, wouldn't you? And you want to resolve this question of causality, right? Look, these observational studies. You're always going to be able to find people that will fight you about assumptions you make and so on. If you looked at all those samples, I mean, you found, I think you've correctly identified the CDC cherry picking data in order to get its conclusion, right? But that's the kind of fight you always have with observational studies.
Right. But they also basically just put in the same wording in all of their publications. Like, this is why we know masks are essential to reduce the cases.
Okay, but here's my question, Tracy. Yeah. Why didn't they run a randomized study? A randomized study would have solved the causal question. It would have resolved that question at a time when there's tremendous controversy over it. It's not that they don't have the resources. They just didn't do it. They just didn't run a randomized study of masking in schools and whether it had any effect on transmission. And that's the key question, right?
Well, they didn't do a lot. I mean, I would say, when it came to COVID transmission in schools, we were independent researchers working on our own time to get the data. And so, I don't think that there were people who were in charge at the CDC who saw running a randomized study as a priority. And I mean, that's a problem. But I think that, you were the first person actually to point out to me the Cochrane review when that first came out. I'm sorry. Is my that was
interesting. No, you're doing fine. So that was really interesting, because I think that this is when we first physically spoke. You and I had been invited by some folks to have a debate with Randy Weingarten, the head of the American Federation of Teachers, the primary teachers union in the United States. And it was amazing that she agreed to do a debate. I remember it was you, me, and then there was like the former head of the AMA.
Yeah, Patrice Harris and Erwin Redliner. And it was for Open Schools USA, organized it with Eric Hartman and Michelle Walker.
Yeah. And I remember that. I'll never forget that debate. That was so interesting. So first of all, Tracy, you were fantastic in that debate. Like, you had, you outlined just this vast literature on whether masks were necessary. You talked about the European debate. You were the most substantive person in that debate. I was very, very impressed. And I think the other side, I don't think they cited a single study.
I agree with that. I mean, they seemed surprised. They seemed genuinely surprised that there were already studies at the time suggesting that were, high quality, suggesting that masks weren't as effective as we were being led to believe in the United States.
Patrice Williams, at one point during that debate, Patrice Williams, the former head of the AMA, the American Medical Association, she told, I think she was told Randy Weingarten that she was going to continue to mask every flu season into perpetuity. And it seemed like, this is when I brought up the Cochrane review of mask studies, because there was a long literature before the pandemic on whether masking can reduce flu. It's directly on point.
Yes.
Flu transmission.
Exactly.
And it finds nothing. Like it failed. It does a dozen randomized trials fail to find anything, any efficacy of masking on reducing flu. randomized
I want to bring up the point that 4 of those studies actually included children that were masked down to age 3. Those were from China and the United States. And those, one of them had almost 50% children. So those studies had between 20 and 50% children. So those were household transmission studies, and they were also negative for the primary endpoints, for the intention to treat, for those who understand what that means, protocol. So the unadjusted, basically like what they were initially looking to find, they didn't find masks were effective to prevent influenza transmission or upper respiratory virus transmission. And so we had that going into the pandemic. And so I think, the question is, did we really need to run the randomized trials in schools? And my question, I question this for 2 reasons. One is because, so we had the data from Norway already showing us how limited the transmission in the schools already was without the masks. So how big of a study are we going to need to even find this tiny benefit? And then given the fact that we already know this benefit, if it exists, is going to be so tiny, like, is it worth covering children's faces and teachers' faces for? Like, that's why I never understood this argument, actually, to have the randomized trials just to sort of capitulate to the people who, were saying we have to mask by default. I didn't understand that. And my Swedish
but like the CDC director gets in front of Congress and says, and she's asked this question, why didn't you run a randomized trial for masking? And what she says is that we didn't run a randomized trial because there wasn't equipoise. Yeah. So let's just translate that. What she was trying to say is that we know for certain, with absolute certainty, that masks are necessary to protect children and others, such that if you were to randomize them and you did a coin flip, it turns tails and you don't have a mask, we are unethically denying you a access to a life-saving technology.
Right. So basically what she's saying is across the entire world, there's no disagreement among the experts, like children should mask. And so, of course, that's ridiculous, because the European CDC actually recommended against children under the age of 12 masking from the beginning. The World Health Organization said don't mask children under the age of 6. So the fact that she was saying there was no equipoise, it was like she had completely shut off, all of the literature from every other country. And she was like, well, as long as we're talking within the United States, which is just, international experts think. That's part of how you define whether or not there's equipoise. So it was ridiculous that she was saying there wasn't equipoise. I think one could argue at that time, though, that most of the world at the time that she said it had come to the side of, we should not be masking children because children really weren't masked anymore.
Ironically, she was right. There was not equipoise. The equipoise, right. There was no equipoise. Like, everyone basically was reasonable, had looked at the extensive evidence and concluded that masking was not necessary, especially for children.
Yeah. And you could say that and it's true that we still actually don't know if there's a small benefit, because we have never run a randomized trial in schools. Like, maybe we could have cluster randomized schools all over an entire state, and we might have found like a small benefit. Although even in that, we could have said, well, maybe children who are wearing masks are less likely to get close to each other, less likely to talk to each other. So we wouldn't have known, like, was it the masks or not, had we even run the trial. So then it gets back to this whole question again of, like, what are we even doing?
So there's sometimes there would be this like counter narrative where people would say, well, look, you can't run a randomized trial. A randomized trial that have been run, you didn't get perfect compliance. Some of the randomized studies, like, 50% or 60% masked and 40% didn't. Right. And then so people would say, the people who are in favor of masks would say, well, look, in these trials you're pointing to, most people, like half the people didn't mask, a third of the people didn't mask. You didn't really run a real test. But I always thought of that as completely missing the point, right? You have a randomized trial. People, the researchers are there wanting you to be masked because they flipped a coin in your heads. They want you to be masked. and they're not doing it.
Right.
And now you extend the study to the real world, and you expect when there isn't someone looking over your shoulder that everyone's going to comply with you. The studies were telling you something real. If you didn't get compliance in the studies, you're not going to get compliance in the real world either, short of some draconian, police on every street making sure you're masked up even inside your house.
That's right. So if your intervention, if people refuse to do it, then you have to admit, maybe it doesn't work if people are going to refuse to do it in real life. And it actually makes me want to bring up another study that I did with one of I believe he was actually a PhD student of yours, Neeraj Sood, that we did.
He was a dean at USC for a long, he's not a professor. Yeah, he's my very first student.
Hi, everyone. A quick word from our first and exciting sponsor, Alchemy Elements. Alchemy Elements is a powerful adaptogenic supplement. For those of you who don't know, adaptogens are a class of plant compounds, primarily herbs and mushrooms, which can help build the mind and body's resistance to stress. Alchemy Elements contains a very unique and carefully selected blend of 9 adaptogens, such as lion's mane, cordyceps, polygalaroot, and shilajit, and they can help boost energy, boost your immunity, and increase focus and overall stabilize your mood. It can have a wide array of effects, which can often depend from individual to individual, but it's a great way to start your morning and generally increase your focus and your energy levels. You can just pour 1 scoop of Alchemy Elements into your morning coffee or your protein shake or smoothie, and you're off to the races. It's a great way to start the day. I use it every day. I find that it can generally stabilize my mood levels and increase focus, especially if I want to get a big project done or finish a very important task. Alchemy Elements often is a great way to kind of start and get my focus going and get me primed for whatever task I want to accomplish. We're very excited and very happy to work with Alchemy Elements. We've been working with them for a couple of months, and now in this new iteration of the podcast, we're going to continue our relationship, which is very special to us because Alchemy aligns with our mission and values of individuals taking greater ownership of their personal mental and physical health and relying less and less on corrupt and flawed generalized kind of medical advice, and less reliance on pharmaceutical drugs, and more of general interest and focus on holistic health. For a limited time, Illusion of Consensus readers and listeners can get 10% off their first order using the code word Illusion, or 30% off a subscription monthly order, where you can get a monthly shipment of Alchemy Elements delivered to you. For the subscription orders, you can also get with it a bonus gold kit to store your Alchemy Elements. Overall, I think Alchemy is a fantastic product. I highly recommend you check them out in the link below in this podcast, wherever you're listening, Spotify, Apple, Substack, Rumble, or YouTube. Just go to the link, use the code word Illusion, and you can get your discount and you won't regret it.
Yes, he's at USC now. And with Josh Stevenson and Shannon Hike, we did the study in Fargo, North Dakota. It was actually a prospective study because we knew that 2 adjacent school districts that both had around 12,000 K through 12 students in Fargo, North Dakota, were going to adopt different mask policies. And so we wanted to see what was the difference in case rates in these 2 districts, one that was going to have a mask mandate and one that wasn't. And so we found that in the time period when they had different mask mandates in the fall of 2021, that there was no significant difference in the case rates. And then in the spring semester, they adopted the same policy, which was no mask mandates. And there was the similar no significant difference. And we were able to rule out any difference that would have been bigger than 1.5%. And so, because we had that crossover design, it actually ended up it was able to eliminate a lot of the bias that a lot of the studies have of masking that, maybe they're testing more or less, or, they're doing things differently at the districts that do and don't have the mask mandates. And so we didn't actually detect that there was any. So
Tracy, did you send this study to the MMWR? Did you?
We didn't send it to MMWR, but I will say it looks like it's going to be published in a really good journal. It's a preprint right now, but I'll kind of leave. That's good. That's good. We maybe gave up on MMWR by that point.
I think you were wise. Okay, so I want to. We've been talking about masks, and clearly, I'm going to just summarize, if I may. If you don't like the summary, please let me know. But it seems to me that the scientific data were pointing one way, and that public health authorities are pointing exactly the opposite way, trying to create an illusion of consensus based simply just on their authority that masks are necessary and work, when in fact the scientific data from around the world we're painting a much, much different picture.
I mean, yes, I do feel like they wanted to create the sense that we were doing something like, we at the CDC care, and therefore we're going to tell you to do this, like as if it was going to make us feel safer. But you just, I don't know, you think about that, why would they tell people to do this if they don't have evidence that it works? And at least we know for children that so many different sorts of harms have been reported, especially related to learning and interpersonal relationships and their anxiety levels with the masking, that I truly believe they ended up doing more harm than good by not just admitting, hey, we don't have any good evidence that these masks are working, especially in the school setting. And we do have a systematic review that just came out that I was senior author on with a great group of authors in British Medical Journal, Archives of Disease in Childhood. And I was glad to see that Elon Musk tweeted it. So you always know it gets some good attention after that.
Okay, so I want to turn next from masking to vaccines, and in particular about a key side effect that was found, I'm using the passive voice, you found quite early that vaccines, the COVID vaccines, when used on young men specifically, causes myocarditis, inflammation of the heart, at distressingly high rates. Not everybody. I mean, maybe, I don't know what number you like nowadays, but like I could be argued anywhere between 1 in 2,000 to 1 in 10,000 doses leads to myocarditis in young men. That finding is striking because when you have if you have a side effect as serious as that in a population, you would expect the public health authorities to take it quite seriously. I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to start by asking you, when did the vaccine rolls out into early 2021, late 2020, early 2021, and when did you start getting concerned about myocarditis and this particular side effect? Because I know you've written some papers, some very, very interesting papers on this.
Yeah. So I guess I was first concerned actually about Bell's palsy from the initial clinical trials, but then when I started seeing reports from Israel,
Bell's palsy, that's like half your face is frozen.
Yes, exactly. And right? So I had noticed that there was a statistical imbalance in the initial clinical trials of Pfizer, where they had a higher rate of Bell's palsy. And so I was a little bit nervous about that. So I was really closely watching the vaccine rollout. I was personally, honestly, very nervous about getting vaccinated myself, but believed in protecting my patients at the time. But so I was following the reports out of Israel, and they really started in January of 2021 of young males getting myocarditis at an unexpected rate following the Pfizer vaccine. And, I thought, wow, that's very odd and concerning, because as a sports medicine doctor, I know how concerning myocarditis is. And there's actually a really good Danish study that has linked myocarditis, previous myocarditis, to sudden cardiac death in athletes. And so I was very nervous when I heard about that. And I, then reports came out actually of 2 deaths. I believe this was in February from Israel after from fulminant myocarditis. One of those didn't end up being published in the New England Journal until, gosh, it was like October or November of the next year, even though it looked like it had happened in January or February to a 21-year-old male, I believe it was, who died of post-vaccination myocarditis. But then, so I knew that there was a signal out of Israel. And then we had a signal, actually, the Department of Defense reported a bunch of cases in, I believe it was March, early April. And I remember clearly Rochelle Walensky saying at the end of April that we had, looked and they hadn't seen any cases. And I remember at the time thinking, how can she say that? Israel is already reporting it, and there have already been reports, internally in the United States. And so that's when I actually think it was Andrew Bostom, who was the first person who started looking into VAERS, and then because he was
VAERS is what's a vaccine adverse event reporting system.
Yep.
And it's a system set up by like the FDA and the CDC to collect data on things that happen to people after they've been vaccinated in a few days or weeks or after they've been vaccinated.
Right.
And it's reported on both by patients and potentially also by doctors, right?
Right. And so I started looking then with Allison Krug, who was my co-author on this study at the VAERS database when the vaccine rollout happened in adolescents in May of 2021. And we started seeing cases rolling in with elevated troponin and EKG changes and
troponin. So that happens when your heart muscle starts to leak because it's suffered some inflammation.
Exactly. And so we were disturbed by these cases, and so I actually consulted John Mandrola, who's a cardiologist, and he became involved in the study to help validate and verify that the cases that we included were consistent with the CDC's working definition of myocarditis, and that he also felt as a cardiologist that these
you're looking at VAERS. You're looking at VAERS to make sure that the cases that are reported of myocarditis after the vaccine are actually myocarditis.
Right.
You have cardiologists on board now. So you have one arm of like a causal estimate, right? These are all people that have been vaccinated, and some of them have gotten myocarditis.
Right.
But often a criticism of VAERS data is that you don't know what happened what would have happened if the person had not been vaccinated. You don't have a baseline to see how many myocarditis events there would have been in that period for that group or in that period.
So the rate that we were finding and that we ended up reporting was over 100-fold above what you would have expected as the baseline rate. This is for males after the second dose of an mRNA vaccine. So it was Pfizer at the time. That was the only one that was given to the adolescents. And so 100-fold higher than what you would expect at baseline. That's definitely going to make you think, okay, this is, due to the vaccine. But there was also this temporal relationship where by far the highest amount of cases happened. They happened this median of 2 days after the vaccine. And so, and you can read through people's notes as well and say, and look at how the doctors and the people who are reporting these will describe, that the symptoms started shortly after the vaccine. And so anyway, seeing this 100-fold deviation from baseline is incredibly concerning, because when people use VAERS to look at like mortality related to the vaccine or cardiac arrest, like those are extremely common things just at baseline. And so you would never find 100-fold deviation unless it was like the most lethal substance ever. And so what myocarditis is so relatively rare compared to the other things that people report, that we were able to see that there was this enormous deviation from the background rate. And CDC themselves admitted that there was this deviation from the background rate. So they were basically stating that there was this causal relationship even in June of 2021. We just found a much larger rate of it than they were reporting. And of course, our rate was subsequently found to be a low estimate compared to what came out of other countries. So like Hong Kong, for example, they found 1 in 2,800 adolescent males got myocarditis. They were actually hospitalized after the second dose of the Pfizer vaccine. So we found between 1 in 6,000, 1 in 6 to 10,000. And what we did that was a little bit unique was we compared that to the potential benefits of the vaccine, and basically looking at, the risks of COVID and how much the vaccine could potentially decrease their risk of hospitalization. And what we found was that the risks of myocarditis after the vaccine in otherwise healthy boys that weren't considered high risk, that those harms were going to outweigh even any potential benefits, assuming that they gotten the first dose. And so it was just kind of that was another aspect of our study that I think was highly controversial.
That's a really important point, because I think a lot of people in the public debate over the vaccines, especially for young men, have got a key kind of analysis confused, right? So very often you'll see online and elsewhere a comparison between the rate of myocarditis that happens after someone just gets COVID infected, and they'll compare it against the rate of myocarditis, whatever they think it is, after the vaccine, after vaccination.
Right.
And they'll say, well, one side you'll say, oh, well, look, COVID is more likely to cause myocarditis than the vaccine. Other side will say vice versa. But what you're saying is that that is the wrong comparison. It's not relevant because the vaccine doesn't stop you from getting COVID.
Right.
So in a sense, what you have is, if you get the vaccine, you have two draws of the myocarditis slot machine, right? One's from COVID and one's from the vaccine potentially.
Right.
Right. So it's an incorrect comparison to ask whether COVID is more likely or less likely to cause myocarditis. That's not the relevant question. You're saying the right thing to do is ask whether the vaccination alters the rate at which you get myocarditis if you get COVID, and then now you have a complete picture: the myocarditis from the vaccine itself, and then also the myocarditis risk from COVID, which is not prevented by the vaccine.
Right, exactly. And so, at the time that we did the initial study, it was still really not understood how effective the vaccines were going to be long term. Though by the time it came out in August of 2021, we were already starting to see that, this breakthrough infection is not like an exception. This seems to be now it's happening to everyone. And
by then, Tracy, the international evidence was really clear on that.
Yes,
point,
exactly. Right? From like Qatar, for example. And so I don't feel like we ever got a satisfactory answer about whether or not the vaccines reduced the risk of myocarditis, because things got very confounded with the fact that most people had already been infected. And then we ended up getting this like less virulent variant with Omicron. And so I do feel like what you're saying is correct, that we don't know. It's whether or not the vaccines reduce our risk of of myocarditis due to COVID, and we don't know if the vaccines reduce the risk of long COVID, for example. But one thing that I really want to highlight is that if you look at, there's a very good Nordic study that came out from prior to the Omicron variant and prior to the widespread population immunity. I shouldn't say there had already about a third of the population had been infected. But what they ended up finding was that there were no cases of post-COVID myocarditis in children under 16 in any of the Nordic countries. They actually included 4 in the study: Finland, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. And so that should make people stop and think, who are saying like that, the myocarditis from COVID is always more risky than from the vaccine, when you have 4 countries and none of them is reporting any cases of post-COVID myocarditis. And so, there was some of that in the United States where if you listen to some of the ACIP meetings, there were some experts initially who were saying, listen, if you take MIS-C, so multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children after COVID out of the equation, they weren't seeing real myocarditis after COVID anyway. So, but this is a problem where we didn't have the randomized trials initially in children that were large enough to determine whether or not the vaccines even reduce the risk of severe COVID.
Well, I mean, the trials in children, the primary endpoint was actually just production of antibodies. The primary endpoint was not any clinical endpoint.
For the adolescents, they looked at the decrease in the infection risk. But for the children, for the 5 to 11-year-olds, it was just the antibody production. And it's like that's not even meaningful. And then we're left with these observational studies that are likely fraught with bias, and so we don't get the answer about how effective the vaccines were.
But okay, so these data are coming out in like late summer, early autumn 2021, right in time for schools for universities and schools to get back. But many of the universities in the United States actually required that their students be vaccinated, including male students. What are the ethics of that? Like, it seems to me that if you have a disease that is relatively low risk to harming a population age group, let's say young people, the college age people, and you have some evidence that the vaccination actually can cause harm in that group, probably net harm, right? Because COVID is relatively mild in that group compared to many other risks that they face. And then you condition their enrollment in school, something that's vital to their own future, on taking that. Essentially, it's a kind of coercion. And I think, Tracy, if I remember, you wrote a really interesting paper on the ethics of this.
Yeah. So we wrote a paper. I was senior author on this. Kevin Bardosh and Ali Krug were the first authors on it. Had a number of great scientists working on it, looking at the risks and benefits of sort of what we knew as potential benefits of the vaccine versus the harms that we'd seen from the randomized studies. And we ended up finding it was at over 18-fold higher rate of anticipated severe adverse events versus how many COVID hospitalizations could be prevented under an ideal scenario. And so we weren't even taking into account the fact that this effect was going to wear off. So we were, just looking at like one semester. But so the issue, I really think that the crux of the matter is not only that no one ever demonstrated that the benefits of the boosters in that population would outweigh the harms, but that we had documented deaths from myocarditis in young males from the vaccine at this point. And so many of these males and females alike had already been infected. And so did they even stand to benefit anything from this, from getting vaccinated, even with the first dose of the vaccine? And then you have this issue of basically, not allowing these young people to choose for whether or not they get a vaccine that doesn't even affect anyone else's risk of getting infected for anything more than, a couple months. And to me, I mean, it was kind of like unbelievable that we were dealing with this situation, because it didn't seem like anyone who was requesting the mandates understood the data at all. And beyond that, I had moved here from Denmark in 2015, And there were no vaccine mandates, not for children to get, and none of the vaccines were required for children to get to go to school. And I'm not just talking about the COVID vaccines. It's the culture there. They explain to parents the risks and the benefits. And in this case, if it was college students, they would explain to the students, this is what we know about the potential benefits. This is what we know about the risks, and let them choose. So, I've always had trouble wrapping my mind around this culture of like, oh, you don't get to choose. If you say no, your children can't go to school. And I was very surprised when I moved back from Denmark as well, that suddenly I was being told that I had to get the influenza vaccine at UC Davis. And otherwise I had to wear a mask in the hospital every day, all of flu season. And I guess, the idea of the mandate, and this contrasts this with the fact that I wasn't even offered the influenza vaccine in Denmark. Now, I could have gotten it had I wanted it, but they don't recommend it for people under 65. And so this whole culture of mandates, I think, is really ethically problematic, because anyone should, in my view, should be able to refuse a medical product. And the fact that we've carved out an exception for vaccines seems inconsistent with the way we treat all other medications and medical interventions.
I mean, so like the Steelman argument for the other side is that if you have a group of people that for whatever reason is unvaccinated, maybe they have medical reasons to be unvaccinated or whatever, if you don't have a mandate, that group is at risk, because the disease are more likely to spread to that group. And by mandating the vaccines, for whatever they are, you are reducing the risk to the unvaccinated group. Right? I think and I could pitch that in economic language, but I think that's the heart of it, is that you want to protect the unvaccinated group.
Yeah, I do understand that argument. And I guess I would just, I would say, there's a problem with asking like young, healthy people to take on a risk in the situation where they may not get any benefit to protect other people. And I know that you also agree that on some level there's an ethical, conundrum or a problem with that. And so, I think that's why the Scandinavian culture has been more, at least historically, hesitant to say that children have to get this or that vaccine. And they definitely became more that way after the Pandemrix vaccine ended up causing narcolepsy in children. And this was the influenza vaccine.
During H1N1.
During H1N1 flu, exactly. Yeah. And then they kind of realized that, wow, all these children who really were at very little risk from influenza ended up developing a lifelong, condition that's very serious, developing narcolepsy. And I think that throughout, Scandinavia, Northern Europe, a lot of the countries started thinking, is this really ethical to ask children to take on this risk to really protect, other like older people in the population?
I mean, I can think of at least, I think that's a great argument, and I find it quite persuasive, as you probably anticipated. But I can think of two other arguments, at least in the context of the COVID vaccine mandates, that are against the mandates themselves. So the second one is that the vaccine doesn't stop you from getting or spreading COVID. Right. The idea that the unvaccinated, the vaccinated, that you have to get vaccinated in order to protect the unvaccinated, it's just physically untrue in the context of the COVID vaccine. You can get COVID from it being next to a vaccinated person. Absolutely. Yes. And so there's no categorical difference in the sense of like, oh, you have to be vaccinated in order to protect grandma. But being vaccinated doesn't protect grandma.
Right. And there's still a question about whether or not multiple vaccines might lead to more infections, although that's, it's possible. I mean, that's observational data too. But yeah, no, I agree.
And then the third argument. There's this paradoxical effect that you have public health people who are like, well, these unvaccinated people are somehow pariahs, bad guys, and we have to do everything we can to make their lives miserable, and or else make them comply with what we want them to do. The paradoxical effect is that, and maybe this is not so paradoxical, it makes people who are in that group say, screw you. I don't believe you. I don't like you. I don't believe you when you say, oh, these other vaccines are necessary for me.
Yes. Yeah.
It actually reduces the demand, not just for the vaccine that you're trying to force them to take, the COVID vaccine, but other vaccines as well that may be actually quite vital to their health.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I think it's definitely made a lot of people angry because people can sort of they can see through it. They're saying, listen, you're telling me I need to get this vaccine to protect other people, and I see that my vaccinated friends have gotten COVID and they've passed it on to other people, and they can read the literature themselves. But I like the fact that more people are sort of opening their eyes to the fact that everything that our public health officials tell us is, that we can't necessarily just, accept it as 100% truth. Like I definitely encourage people to do their own research and, be their own advocates. But at the same time, I do feel like people need someone who they can trust, who they can go to, who will give them accurate information about what we do and don't know. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you about the COVID vaccines, and I would just remind people that there was a big push in California to get the COVID vaccines on the childhood vaccination schedule. That luckily that didn't end up passing. I mean, yeah, a lot of kids would have been out of school.
We're nearing the end of the hour, and that I promised to keep you. I think I'm going to keep you just a little bit longer than that, because I want to make sure people hear the personal costs that you face. I mean, we've talked about many studies during this past hour. I think you've worked on something like 24 studies, published studies on COVID. One of the most productive researchers I know of, looking at various aspects of the COVID policy, and truly an incredibly productive time. And you've shaped how many people think about these crucial policy issues. But I want people to know what personal costs you face for that. So I'm going to go back. We talked about the study you did about myocarditis in young men and in VAERS. You published that study, or you said do a preprint of that study. At the time, you're working at UC Davis. And what happened? How did your employer, UC Davis in the medical school, how did your employer treat this really important finding that young men are impacted by this COVID vaccine in this negative way?
Yeah. So I kind of hardly know where to begin, but I will say that so I was kind of recently out of fellowship, and when COVID started, I had just started in private practice, and I became it was like a voluntary clinical professor, it was called at the time, at UC Davis, and I had residents and medical students that I was working with, and I was doing actually a couple large research projects, and one that was, it was like ultra marathon running, and one that was on ACL injuries and looking at regenerative therapies, and I don't need to get into details of those, but so I had a very good relationship with the people in the department, and sort of lots of things going on. And so when COVID hit, I started, basically investigating like what I viewed were the most important societal questions of the day, and finding, researchers who were interested in looking at the same issues. And so I guess I thought I wasn't being paid to do any of this research, but I was under the false impression that in doing research on the school reopening, as someone who's an epidemiologist, and on the COVID vaccines and mask effectiveness, that this was somehow going to be viewed as helpful to society, and that I was, doing this on my own free time. It didn't occur to me that this was actually going to be a problem. And so I guess I was very surprised when I basically started to get phone calls from my chair at UC Davis, and also complaints over social media from people where the Office of Research was sort of responding sort of like, like acting like I wasn't in any way important to UC Davis, and like that I was doing the sports research, but that that I did. They said I didn't have an academic position, even though which is true. But I did have these medical students and residents that I was working with, and on different research projects. And so I felt very sort of like I was really quickly ostracized, and not that I ever thought I was going to be thanked for doing it, but I was very surprised by how it was found to be unhelpful. But with the
so in other words, UC Davis, you do these early studies, including some very prominent ones. It ends up in MMWR for the Wisconsin Mass Study. They're distancing you, and you have a PhD in epidemiology.
Right.
You have a background in exactly this research. You have a position at UC Davis to do research.
Right.
You finished the fellowship there. So, but rather than, they could have just said nothing, but they actually actively distanced themselves from you.
Right. So they deleted like my picture and profile from the department website. And then after the myocarditis study came out, I was asked to come to attend meetings with the chair of epidemiology, and there were discussions about the methods of our study, and actually he didn't find major issues with it, and we actually thanked him in our peer-reviewed published version of it, and I thought nothing was going to come of that, but then I ended up losing my position at UC Davis shortly thereafter, and so
you lose your job. Just so listeners understand, you lose your job in an academic department in medicine because you have a finding that somebody there doesn't like, and it ultimately ends up being right. It ends up being published in a peer-reviewed journal. It's replicated by other authors using different methods. And it's on a central policy issue, like should we be recommending the vaccine to young men, specifically. Is there a side effect for young men? This very specific side effect that could harm them, right? So for that, you lose your job.
Well, and I want to make it clear that they didn't give that as the reason. And they said that the reason was that the recruitment for one of the studies that I had been working on had been slower than anticipated. And I just want to point out that this was during COVID. And so a study on ACL injuries, like not as many people were playing soccer and skiing as there had normally been. And so it was actually not surprising that our recruitment had slowed down. But the issue was that we had already enrolled participants in a clinical trial, and we had I had medical students working with me who were going to be doing a research selective with me. And so the study ended up having to stop. The medical students lost out on an opportunity to do this study. And not only that, but I had recently been giving a lecture to medical students about how important it is to do research that you think is going to be impactful on the community and on people's health. And then, they see me lose my job after I published the studies that I had been discussing and speak about them publicly. And it sends a message. And the whole time I have to be honest, I was not upset about what happened with the position, because, I have a job in private practice, and I was doing consultant epidemiology work. I ended up going on to work at UCSF. And so, I knew these things tend to work out, but the issue is more that, so I ended up losing my position, and participants, patients in our study ended up losing out. Medical students ended up losing out, and medical students and residents see what happened and they get the message. It's just better to stay quiet and not do anything controversial.
I mean, I'll tell you from my perspective. So I'm a tenure position at Stanford, and I faced a tremendous pressure within Stanford, but I was protected because I have a senior position. Seeing how you were treated in a relatively junior position and unprotected, it makes me wonder whether the universities, which are supposed to be bastions of free inquiry and knowledge, and you're doing rigorous work, whether people agree or disagree, that's a scientific matter. That shouldn't be a question of whether you should be punished for it, which I think it's almost impossible to conclude otherwise.
Yeah.
There was another incident I want to talk about relating to your mask work and your school's work. You were involved in a fantastic thing called the urgency of normal, and I remember just seeing a group of you and a few researchers from UCSF from around the country come together and say, here's a toolkit for how to open schools safely.
Yeah.
And I was quite pleased to see this movement come out, because that to me seemed like the most important policy problem that we'd had at the time, which is our schools in 2021 were still closed when, for no good reason, harming especially poor children for nothing. Yeah. And here's a constructive path forward. And your urgency of normal, that engendered a huge negative reaction among some in the medical community. And you mentioned to me at some point that you started getting people coming into your private practice trying to essentially like fake patients, trying to like trick you or something. Well, Can you describe? I'm sure I got some details wrong. Please tell me that story.
Yeah. So, I mean, I just want to say I had such a good experience with urgency of normal that, that in my mind takes over everything negative that happened. It outweighs the negatives, because I met so many wonderful people who were really sort of, advocating for the well-being of children and, looking at the data in an objective way. And just, I met lifelong friends through that group. And I do think that we made a really big impact, and we were able, to get the last schools open. And I think that we brought a lot of attention to the fact that we might not need these masks. They might not be doing, what we're being told they're doing. And so it was a great grassroots movement. But I would say, online, I was pretty good at ignoring what people were saying to me online. But when we got like a call at my clinic that there was a person who was saying that they wanted to kill me, and very threatening. And so we ended up having to increase our security in my clinic. And there was actually an MD PhD doctor who was basically stalking me and writing about like where I was running during, in the morning, or like, what I was doing, and would obsessively tweet over and over again about how he thought I should lose my medical license. And so, I think that we live in a new sort of world where, we and academics and physicians and scientists who are willing to put ourselves out there and try to, discuss our research or, defend what we think, may be the best overall pathway in terms of, people's health, that we take a big risk. And I want to say that I'm sure most of your people listening now have listened to your interview with Matthias Desmet, but it was so brilliant, because I do think a lot about the fact that the way that humans are now treating other humans online is not the way that we were meant to interact with each other. And it's one of the things that's made me hesitant about continuing to post things on social media, because I wonder ultimately, sometimes how productive these interactions are. And so for that reason, I'm very grateful for podcasts like this, because, we get to interact more as normal humans, and people can see the human side of us, and not like this person writing words behind a screen that's like disembodied, that's just an easy target of attack. Because I think you and I both agree that humans, we tend to be good, and we have this good inside of us, and it's a question about like bringing it out in each other, and also about working together with each other, because we have such various backgrounds and talents. And, it's really a shame that people are being silenced and ostracized, because, that hurts all of us in the end when people are taken out of the conversation like that.
It's striking, Tracy, because I've learned from your work through the whole pandemic, and of course we got to be good friends through the pandemic, which is one of the blessings of it. But it really, but it took courage on your part to keep speaking out, keep doing science, keep talking, and keep engaging. And what your goal was the well-being of children, the use of technology appropriately. Evidence-based medicine, ideas that I thought had wide support within medicine. And yet within medicine itself, people like you were made to pay a price for doing those things. This is why when we started the podcast, I called you a hero. I really do believe that. And I'm tremendously grateful that you have continued to stay strong despite the personal attacks. And I'm grateful that we got to know each other through the pandemic. Anyway, so we'll end with that. I thank you, Tracy, for joining me. This is Professor Jay Bhattacharya for the Illusion of Consensus podcast. I've been talking with Dr. Tracy Beth Høeg, who's probably one of the most important epidemiologists writing during this pandemic. Thank you for joining us. Until next time.
Has the dust settled from the COVID policy response? Far from it. The storms are many: inflation, learning losses, ill health, high crime, broken government services, displaced workers, substance abuse, mass loneliness, discredited science, real estate crisis, censorship, and overweening state power. The world is on fire with war, mass killings, crime, hunger, revolution. The lack of accountability, or even so much as an apology, is a foreshadowing. They'll keep their newfound powers and try it all again. Brownstone Institute is seeking answers, undertaking important research and publishing the results while providing fellowships for dissident scholars who have been professionally displaced. It's not about this one crisis. We urgently need to restore peace, prosperity, and integrity in science and journalism. Visit brownstone.org for more. We may never get to the truth, but we can get closer to the truth. There will be no stopping the efforts.